Welcome, everyone, to the Capital Press Club podcast series. I'm your host and CPC President, Dr. Colin Campbell. I'm really excited that all of you could be here and listen to this podcast. Our guest is award-winning journalist Richard Prince, who writes as the main columnist for Journal-isms. It's a news column on diversity issues in news media. He's won multiple awards, including several from the National Association of Black Journalists and many more. And I would just like to welcome Richard Prince to the podcast series. Welcome, sir.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, Richard, definitely a veteran journalist. You have so many accolades behind your name. How did you first get started in journalism?
Well, I think I've always been in journalism, even as a student um, in junior high school, and then I worked on the school paper in high school and as well as in college, and then I went out into the world of professional journalism up in New. I'm from New York, and I was in working at the New York Star Ledger um, on the weekends when they had their riot in the late 60s, 1967. And then I came to DC in 1968 after DC had its riot. So I, I was in that area. You just, it was kind of explosive, and uh, the news industry was part of the broader picture in that we had to integrate and um, uh, uh, make sure that we heeded the demands of the communities, which were demanding better coverage, more people of color working there, and that led to uh, at the Washington Post our filing of a complaint uh, with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in 1972. And then 3 years later, the NABJ was formed, and I think that the WABJ, the Washington Association, was formed around about a year earlier, I believe, a year or so earlier, 1975. And so it's been, this been we've had a heck of a ride from then till now. All of our objectives, of course, have not been met, but we keep on pushing, and now we have more people to as part of the effort, and we have racial reckoning going on now in the news industry as well as in the country itself. So we've made even more progress. But as they always say, there's still more to be done.
That's right. One of the things that I enjoy talking to you about is just some of your history when it comes to journalism. Now, you made several decades sound like just a snap of the fingers. And in between that, there has been so much that you have been intimately involved in. One of the things that I'd like our audience to know is that when you talked about filing the complaint against the Washington Post, I believe, you were part of the Metro 7. And that was
Correct.
a groundbreaking group of people who were discussing some of the disparities that they were facing in one of the biggest news circulations in the country. Not only that, around the time that you were really, you said you've always been a journalist, but I'm sure your interest was even more piqued around the times of the riots that you talked about in the late 60s. That was the same time as the Kerner Commission report was coming out and
Exactly.
talking about the disparities in journalism news coverage. And you were right there on the front lines. I don't even know where to begin with you right now, actually, but if you could tell us a little bit about, I get excited talking to you because you know the history of journalism in this country very intimately. You've been involved in it and you have a large perspective on it. I guess I would start with the Kerner Commission as something that you have very vast knowledge of. Could you tell our audience a little bit about it and why it's so relevant today?
Well, the Kerner Commission was formed by President Lyndon Johnson after the riots of 1967, and they made a report in 1968. Johnson wanted to find out wanted this commission to find out um, what were the causes of the riots, and he suspected the communists were behind it. This was at the height of the Cold War, and then the commission came back and said no, the communists weren't behind it. it was our own the conditions that African Americans were facing, and one of the chapters was specifically devoted to the news media, saying that they view uh, their coverage through the lens of white men, and that they needed to broaden that lens because they were presenting a distorted picture, and so a lot of American news consumers were surprised when these rebellions or disturbances, whatever you want to call them, erupted, because they were not since what was going on was not really um, being covered properly. That they had no idea that of what the conditions were like. Now, I will point out that all this did not start in the late 60s. We have a group that we call the Journal-isms Roundtable, where it's now being held by Zoom. But our most recent one, which was on December the 12th, which can be accessed, by the way, we video recorded it, and it's on the journal-isms.com web page. We brought in the authors of a new book that is titled Journalism and Jim Crow, and they discussed there the blatant racism that existed in the news media uh, up until way up in the early part of this century, all through last century, and you might some of the viewers of this might be familiar with the Wilmington Riots of 1898. That's Wilmington, North Carolina. And there, what happened was that uh, black people were making progress in that town. There was a multiracial government, city government, but white people became more and more upset by this fact, and so they burned down the black newspaper, and they chased out all of the uh, black office holders who fled to other places. And this was very, if you look at what happened, it's very similar to what happened here in DC on January 6th. So that was just one example of the kinds of things that were going on um, uh, before we reached the 1960s. And we, of course, had the Black press and people like I.W. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois of the crisis who were fighting all of this. And so what their book was talking about, and what we had several veterans who were part of the call, were talking about was how uh, the black press was so essential in those days to tell the real story. And then when we had people who were just trying to describe uh, what was happening in those times, they had to turn to the black press because they were telling what was really going on. A lot of the white press was ignoring it or distorting. In fact, they had a reporter from the Washington Post who was down in Wilmington there in 1898, and he marched with the white supremacists. He was at the head of the parade, and he was sending back dispatches that favored the white supremacists. And as the state of North Carolina pointed out when they recapped all of this, uh, having a distorted picture going back to Washington D.C. meant that the people in Congress and the White House did not have a full picture of what was going on, and therefore they did not send federal troops or take other measures that might have averted that situation. So there's a lot of history with newspapers and even broadcasters uh, and people of color, particularly African Americans, and the need to integrate and be more accurate in the story they tell of what was going on in the United States.
Yeah, and in addition to that, you were already facing lots of discrimination at the Washington Post as well. Tell us how the Metro 7 played into what was going on around that time and some of the disparities that were being faced racially in news media and particularly at the Washington Post.
Well, the Washington Post, I have to give them credit because they had us there in the first place. The Washington Post was considered a liberal newspaper, and they the Metro 7 began organizing. Just actually started off as 9 people. When we started comparing notes, why was the Shirley Chisholm campaign not being covered? Why did they close the Africa Bureau? Why did the people who are running the desk for covering the District of Columbia actually living in Maryland and Virginia? And specific things were happening to each of us, and that caused us to draw up we started off with 20 questions, and on the same journalisms.com website, you can see all the documents that went forward between the 9 and then 8 and then 7 of us and Ben Bradley, who was the editor there at the time. He did a pro bono, Clifford Alexander as our lawyer, and Cliff Alexander had been Secretary of the Army, but more importantly, and more relevant to this discussion, he had chaired the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So we knew all about the use of goals and timetables. And that's what we wanted. We wanted some, concrete goals and timetables for achieving progress in terms of black hiring and promotions.
And
And
what
that's what
year
you
are we
saw.
talking about, Richard? What year?
1972.
1972.
1972.
Okay.
That was the year. I was the presidential election year, and that's why I mentioned Shirley Chisholm. She became the first black woman to run for president of a major party,
Right.
and that was all happening in 1972. So that's what happened. The Post resisted. What Brent Bradley said. The only quota we're going to have here is a quota on quality. Uh, and the word quota was a big bugaboo at that time, and so he used that. Um, and our argument was, you've got to do something to measure your progress, and that's what goals and timetables is all about. People have goals and timetables for profits and other kind of achievements. Why not have it for hiring and promoting people of color? So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission (EEOC) found that we did have a case to proceed, but that would have required more money than we had. Cliff Alexander was working pro bono for us, but we didn't have the money to go to court and go through a whole lawsuit, and the Post did. But the benefit of the Metro 7 and that case was that there were actions that the Post took in order to try to to show good faith or to mollify us. But more importantly, perhaps, is that it inspired people at other news organizations, from CBS to New York Times, New York Daily News, to undertake similar challenges at their news organizations. And we're not just talking about African Americans, but women became emboldened as well at the Post and elsewhere. And a lot of those other challenges succeeded, um, uh, much more greatly than we did. In fact, I think there was a $4 million settlement at the New York Daily News. So, you know, as I say, a luta continua. The struggle continues. We had that suit, but of course, things did not end there. In 1972, 1975, NABJ was formed, and WABJ was formed, and they pressed the cause, and it went on, and the mainstream media organizations, such as the American Society of News Editors, uh, fixed a goal that they would have parity with the number of people of color in the general population and American newsrooms by the year 2000. So that was their goal. They didn't meet it. They said it was aspirational, and now it's been reset for 2025, and we'll see if they meet it there. The next big thing that happened along those lines was the George Floyd situation, George Floyd, the police murder of George Floyd, which prompted a racial reckoning in the country that was uh, still going on, in which a lot of news organizations realized that they really need to step up their game in terms of diversity, and began, hiring, appointing diversity officers, and improving their coverage. And so we'll see where all that ends up.
Yeah, a prognostication, if you will. What do you think? You said 2025 is their goal. How does it look
Right.
now? What do you think?
Well, they're not there, and
Mhm.
but there are a lot of bright spots. One of the things that's happened in the meantime is that the economy intervened and the internet intervened, and the rise of the internet was a big blow to print publications because uh, it's not necessarily because they stole readers away, but they stole advertisers away. And so
Mhm.
that meant that they had to be more layoffs. And a lot of newspapers and news organizations were so busy trying to stay afloat that diversity was put on the back burner. Now we have a lot of organizations though that have, as I said, they've stepped up their game. The Gannett Company is one that has says that we are going to meet that goal of 2025. And now around the country, you do see people of color being appointed to uh, top editors roles in several newspapers. We just had Kevin Merida appointed editor of the LA Times. A lot of Black women appointed within Gannett and also outside of Gannett, such as McClatchy, Monica Richardson at the Miami Herald, Raina Cash at the Charlotte Observer, and Dean Baquet is the editor of the New York Times, although that took place before this most recent reckoning. So there has been progress, and yeah, you do see things and articles in the paper that maybe you would not have seen before, uh, and and people being. I think one of the other things that's very important to people of color who work in these newsrooms is a change in the climate, the sense that they are being listened to, that they're at the table, and that they're not just being overlooked. And I think there's more of that now, and I think that's definitely progress. How long it's going to last, we don't know. But once you get people at the top, it's harder to, to turn back.
Yeah, one of the things that we are seeing also more of, instead of waiting for corporate media to put us in positions where we should be, but people are also starting their own publications, their own avenues, and their own conduits in which to exchange information and share information, something that is very familiar to you. So, how did you start Journal-isms? And tell me about the purpose of it, which we did talk about a little bit, is about the diversity, but how is that bringing awareness to the public about what should be happening in our newsrooms and what's happening in the media landscape?
That's a good question. Well, it started as a column in the NAB Journal, which was a publication of the National Association of Black Journalists. And the reason it's hyphenated, Journal-isms, is because the journal part of it comes from the NABJ Journal, and that appeared in the print publication of the NABJ Journal until about let's see, it started in 1991 and it went on through the 90s, I believe. And then in 2002, the Maynard Institute for Journalism Education, which started in about that same 1977 era, um, and who that exists to train journalists of color. They said that their purpose is to eliminate the phrase "can't find anybody qualified." And Dory Maynard, who was the daughter of the founders, Bob Maynard and Nancy Maynard, said, "Well, you know what's missing? There are all these media columns that I see online, and one in particular was popular at the time called Jim by Jim Romanesco. Uh, but they don't have information about us and about diversity. So we need to have somebody who is filling in that gap." And so they asked me to do that, and I did. And so instead of just writing about primarily about Black people, uh, it was broadened to diversity in general, racial diversity, that is, so that what was going on with Native Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos were covered as well as African Americans. And that started in 2002, as I said. And then in around 2016, we went to our own website, which is what exists now, Journal-isms. And the issues are still the same, but the way we have our influence is not directly to the public, although the public can certainly read and follow. But we target other journalists, and particularly journalism executives who have the power to make change, and that's where I think we see our most of our influence. Just by asking a question can prompt some action. Just last week, for example, or maybe 2 weeks by now, the Women's Media Center held an award ceremony, and it was basically diverse people who were receiving the awards. And one of the first ones was to a young Native American who is the anchor of the TV show called Indian Country Today. So she started off by saying, why is it that there are no Native American anchors on any of the network news programs? We exist too, and we have news. And so I wrote about that, but in the process of writing about it, I asked the question myself of the very people representing those networks, and the director of the Radio Television News Directors Association, who represents not the networks themselves, but represents the broadcast industry and primarily local news media, said, "Well, I don't know about what the networks are doing, but I will say this: that since we're in this reckoning, Native Americans definitely need to be included in that." And then I was able to point out uh, how the examples of some of the things that have taken place that were off the mark because there were no Native American journalists. One was when we had all those shootings, the mass shootings, the Pulse nightclub and one in Las Vegas and other places, where the anchors were saying, "Oh, this is the deadliest mass shooting in history," and the Native Americans were saying, "I beg your pardon." In the last interview, I seem to remember a wounded knee and a lot of these other mass shootings that took place, and they presented a list. And I fantasized one of these anchors saying that, and then having a Native American co-anchor uh, turning to him and saying, "Oh, really?" And that's the kind of thing I think that can awaken consciousness, and where we can have most of our influence.
Yeah, I remember that the summer of 2016, I think, when media
Right,
were widely saying this is the worst mass shooting in US history, and
right,
thinking, no, there were definitely worse massacres involving guns
right.
in US history. And I definitely
Yes,
remember
yes,
consciously rewording that phrase, aside
mhm,
from what mass media were saying at the time. So, yeah, definitely
right,
important. When you
right.
look at where we are today, as far as diversity is concerned, I'm sure we could say that it's better than it has been in the past. But where are we lacking? Are we lacking in print? Are we lacking in broadcast? Should we forget about these platforms and really just migrate more towards online, where it seems like a lot of young viewers and audiences are growing?
Well, a lot of young audiences are growing there, but uh, you can't beat having experience and competence and resources. Um, Social media is one thing, but
Sources.
a lot of what we see on social media is not firsthand reporting, but gossip and rumor and picking up what the mainstream media have taken the time to report. That's why one of the uh, most salient initiatives that is taking place is the move to have people of color undertake investigative reporting, where it takes time to dig and go through records, um, and being able to sit there in the courtrooms and in state houses to find out what's going on in these state legislatures that we may not know about. Uh, the people on social media aren't doing that, and that's why we need to have attention um, focused uh, on people, news organizations that have the resources to do that kind of thing. And one of the Nicole Hannah Jones, for example, is very well known right now for the 1619 project, but she is also involved in a project called the Ida B. Wells Society, which is undertaking training of people of color to be investigative reporters who can do that kind of digging and know, how that's done, and filing freedom of information requests, that kind of and the organization of investigative reporters and editors now has a diversity person. So we're sensitizing the people who can actually do real journalism, and I think that's what's important. The other, like I say, the social media is fine; they can call things to our attention, uh, but you also need the people who can do the real digging and the real work of finding out what's going on that we don't know about.
We're winding down now. We just have a minute left. I just wanted to ask you if you could give young journalists out there a message or some advice, what would it be?
It would be stay curious and learn those skills. Be good writing, no history, no geography, because even though the platforms are going to change over time, there are certain basics that will always be with us. You've got to learn how to be accurate in what you report. You've got to have a good background, and as so you can put things into context, and you've got to strive to be excellent.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Richard. And, as with some great guests such as yourself, we could talk to you for another hour or so, but we're going to finish our podcast here. But before we go, we'd like to bestow our appreciation by making you an honorary member of the Capitol Press Club. And we
All
hope that
right.
you become involved with us as we will become more involved in Journal-isms and the Journal-isms Roundtable, which you have once a month. Isn't that correct? Once a month?
Exactly. Our next one
All right.
will be on January the 23rd. So people who won't be there on the Zoom can certainly watch on Facebook. So we're trying to, we want people to watch. We value the interaction.
Great. And tell us your website as well.
All right, it's journal-isms.com.
All right. And we invite our audience members to visit our website as well at capitalpressclub.org. Also, check out our Facebook page and like us and follow us. And make sure that you stay in tune with Capitol Press Club for more of our podcasts and upcoming events. Thanks, all of you, for watching. Take care, and we'll see you next time.